السلام عليكم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. When reading the Quran, sometimes a question comes up as to what is the connection between some verses. Oftentimes, when the context changes, for that you expect the verse to start talking about something else, change the topic. But sometimes Quran is talking about a topic, then in the next verse it appears to talk about something else, another topic, then returns to the previous topic. The question then comes up as to what is the connection of this verse with the current context. Today we want to explain the reason with examples. But before getting into the reasons, let's categorize the verses. Number one, in the Quran we have verses that are standalone in meaning, which means you don't really need to read the verse before or after. The verse itself explains itself and the meaning is obvious. For example, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ. Indeed, Allah enjoins justice and kindness and giving to relatives and forbids indecency and abomination and rebellion. Chapter 16, verse 90. This verse stands on its own as Allah commands a certain mode of behavior or a set of do's and don'ts. Number two, then there are verses that are clearly connected. For example, when the Quran talks about rain and the process of clouds moving by the wind toward the land from the ocean, and then rain that comes down on a dead dry land and brings it back to life where vegetations grow, all described in one verse or multiple verses in which the connection is very clear because we're all familiar with the process and the nature. Then we have number three. There are verses that their meanings may not be well understood without reading the verses before and or after to get the correct and or full meaning that results in better understanding. Here are a couple of examples. We have a verse that says in chapter 107, says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُسَلِّينَ. Woe to those who pray. Well, if you read this verse by itself or see it somewhere by itself, your response will be, what? Woe to those who pray? Why should there be woe to them where God keeps talking highly of those who pray? What's going on? That is when you must read the next verse that explains it. الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ يُرَاءُونَ. Those who are neglectful of their prayers, heedless of their prayers, and those who show off their good deeds. Verses that follow, chapter 107, 5 and 6. As you can see, verses 5 and 6 make the connection and meaning complete. So, verses like these cannot be quoted by themselves. This is called the cut and paste method used by critics of the Quran who take one verse out of its context or part of a verse and accuse the Quran of whatever suits them that day. Another example. فَلَوْ نَشَاءُ لَمَسَخْنَاهُمْ عَلَى مَكَانَتِهِمْ فَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا مُضِيًّا وَلَا يَرْجِعُونَ. And if it had been our will, we could have transformed them to remain in their places, making them powerless to go forward or turn back. And then on the next verse, it says, وَمَنْ نُعَمِّرْهُ نُنَكِّسْهُ فِي الْخَلْقِ أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ. He whom we bring unto old age, we reverse him in creation, making him go back to weakness after strength. Do they not understand? Chapter 36, verses 67 and 68. Here, with this verse, however, one might ask, what is the connection between verse 67 and 68? The connection is there if we just look at the meaning of each verse closely and carefully. Both verses are obviously about the same group of people. And in verse 67, Allah says, if He willed, He could have masked or transformed them on the spot. Change their physical makeup immediately. And this transformation changes them to the point that it would make them powerless or unable to move about. And on the next verse, verse 68, Allah says, those whom we bring to the old age, meaning let them live till they come to the old age, we reverse him in creation. You know, their physical growth and strength reverses when people get old. And they start getting weak, getting slow, with gray hair, or lose their hair, then losing or weakening their eyesight, hearing, and senses. Allah brings up this reverse in creation as an example of what? Example of mask or transformation, to make us understand what Allah could have done to such people. The same thing that happens to the old folks, except much faster and instantly on the spot. Number 4, some verses in the Qur'an are mentioned, and it may not be immediately clear the reason why it says such and such. But then the reason follows if you only continue to read. By reading the next verse, you get the context and full meaning. However, there are verses in the Quran which talk about something, but the reason given in the next verse is not as apparent. There are subtle points that must be paid attention to in order to capture what the Quran is trying to say. As an example, Quran says, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ خَرَجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ وَهُمْ أُلُوفٌ حَذَرَ الْمَوْتِ فَقَالَ لَهُمُ اللَّهُ مُوتُوا ثُمَّ أَحْيَاهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَذُو فَضْلٍ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَشْكُرُونَ. Haven't you seen those who went out from their homes in thousands, cautious of death, trying to dodge death? Allah said to them, die, and then He revived them. Surely Allah is bountiful to the people, but most people do not thank. This is chapter 2, verse 243. Here the meaning of the verse is clear in that these people were scared of death. They left their homes in hopes to escape and protect themselves from death. They thought if they changed their location, they would be safe from death. And Allah proved them wrong as He caused them to die. Some interpretations say that they got some sort of disease or sickness. And then Allah brought them back to life. Or shall we say, saved them, which gives this lesson that Allah, that death is in Allah's hand and predestined by Him. Time and location is determined by Him only. And then in the next verse, the Quran says, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. And fight in the cause of Allah and know that Allah hears and knows all things. Verse 244. You might ask, what's the connection? Above verse is about people trying, verse 243 is about people trying to escape death. And the next verse, talking about fighting in the cause of Allah. The key words that connect the verses are death and fighting. In the first verse, God is saying, your death is in my hand. nothing can stop it or delay it, or nothing can save you from death if I will it or if I destined it. Those people were destined to death, and Allah caused them to die and then saved them or brought them back. So the lesson is, don't try to get around it, or don't be afraid of death. The next verse says, therefore fight in path of Allah. Those who, of course, those who come to fight you, knowing that if you are meant to die, you will die while fighting in His cause. And if you don't die in the battle, know that Allah has saved you and that it was not time for you to die. All is in His hand. When the time comes, you will die even if you are in your own bed. So, when the time comes, won't you rather die in His cause, in the battle in this case? So, first verse is the witness in order to encourage the Muslims to fight against their enemies. This is another example of how the connection between the verses may not be apparent, and it must be discovered through some deliberation and reflection. Number 5, there are verses that talk about a certain subject, but then all of a sudden the subject changes, and the surah, the chapter, talks about something completely different, unrelated. Then jumps back into the current subject. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verses 221 through 241, talk about marriage and spousal relationship, starting from verse 221 to 226. Then, from 227, verses talk about divorce, its conditions and things to be done in the family, all the way through verse 237. So from verse 221 through verse 237, the subject matter is mainly about family affairs, marriage, divorce, and what to do when getting married or divorced. Verse 238, all of a sudden, talks about prayer, as-salat, and as-salawat. And verse 239 says that prayer must be established under any situation or condition. Then verses 240 and 241 go back to family subject, which are about when you leave a family behind and the right of widowed spouses. One might ask, what is the connection between verses 238 and 239 on prayer with the rest of these verses in the passage, which is all about family affairs? Well, with a little contemplation and attention paid to all of the verses, the 20 some odd verses, we gather the following. In earlier verses, that's before 238, regarding marriage, it talks about who you should marry, for example. Do not marry from among idolaters unless they embrace Islam. Then talks about the times intimate relationship between the spouses are not allowed. Then talks about being righteous and God conscious. If the occasion arises for divorce, what is the waiting period during which what to do? The number of divorces, dowry, what to do after the waiting period. Either return to them or let them go, and also not preventing them from marrying another person. When you have a child, what is the nursing period and the duty of mother and the father? What happens to a woman who is widowed, and what is the waiting period? What happens if marriage is not consummated, etc., etc. Then in verses 238 and 239, the Qur'an says, حافظوا على الصلوات والصلاة الوسطى وقوموا لله قانتين. Guard your prayers, your salawat, especially the middle prayer, and stand before Allah with full devotion. Then on the next verse, إن خفتم فرجالا أو ركبانا فإذا أمنتم فاذكروا الله كما علمكم ما لم تكونوا تعلمون. If you fear an enemy, pray on foot or while riding, as may be most convenient. But when you reach safety, remember Allah. Pray to Him in the manner He has taught you, which you did not know before. Then the surah goes back to the subject of family and marriage and says, when you die, don't forget your bequest to your widowed spouse, and provision should be made for widowed women with kindness. That is a right on the righteous man. So you see how these verses flow with obvious connections, with the exception of verses 238 and 239 on prayer, that seem to be mentioned in parentheses. That is what Allah has done. He opens the virtual parentheses here to say, all these issues, commandments related to family affairs are easily addressed by the believers who remember Allah, stay close to Allah by guarding their prayers, especially the one in the middle of the day, which is the time when we're all preoccupied with our jobs and professions and focused on daily affairs, a time that is easy to forget Allah. Verses 238 and 239 say that someone who remembers God, prays to Him, even in the most difficult times, as in war, when his safety is at risk, he still prays to his Lord while walking or riding. This believer will not have any issues obeying God's commands given in the earlier verses. He would not have any issue being a good spouse, being a good advisor, being a fair person, treating others, especially his spouse, kindly. These unpleasant things, like divorce, may not even happen to him and his wife. But if it does, they will fully comply with God's wish. Their daily prayers and remembrance of Allah provides them with the best training and protection so they can face anything, including the family affairs, which they will conduct the best way they can in order to please Allah Azza wa Jal. Another sign, clue, or method in finding the connection is looking for the key words in verses before. Words like, in this case, at-tawwabin wa yuhibbul mutatahhirin, those who turn to Him and purify themselves. Mu'mineen, the believers. Words like tabarru wa tattaqu, those who do good and are careful of their duties toward Allah. These key words give us signs and attributes of those who are God conscious and those who, as a reminder, stick to their acts of worship like salat, prayer, remembering Allah, and focusing on what is important, which is to please Him. We have similar situations that occur when Qur'an talks about the past times, earlier prophets, their stories and their people, what these prophets said to their people and their reaction. Then Allah opens a virtual parenthesis and says to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that what Meccans are saying to you or doing to you happened to earlier prophets. These verses include people of the past who worship the creation, not the creator, the idolaters. Then Allah opens virtual parentheses to ask, don't you see what happens to the dead land or a dry land after Allah causes the rain to bring it back to life so the plants and trees bear fruit in all colors and shapes. It is He who created all that is in the heavens and on the earth. This to mean that if Allah can bring back the dead land, to life, don't you think He can bring you back in the resurrection day? Plus the fact, He is the real creator, not the idols they were worshipping. Then comes back to the main topic, which is idolaters in this case, and says, why do you not use your senses? Why don't you use your mind and still associate partners with Him? Why do you keep, acting as such? Why do you keep, associating partners with Him and not using your mind? You worship idols who had no role in creating you. Then continues with the people of the past and their lives and how, despite all the signs, reminders, and miracles, they rejected their prophets, which is the main context of the passage. And this happens quite often, especially with the chapters that were revealed in Mecca. They were Meccan chapters. From all these examples, we realize that within each topic or subject that make up a passage in the Qur'an, most verses are connected in apparent and obvious ways. But some not so apparent, and it takes some deliberation and careful examination of the passage. That means paying attention to the meaning of verses before and after, and the whole context in order to understand the connection, which then gives us a deeper understanding and appreciation of the Qur'an, its teaching, and even its miracles. Lack of such understanding for those who do not read the Qur'an regularly may lead them to confusion or sometimes misunderstandings, to the point they might think Qur'an has contradictions or perhaps was not put together orderly as it jumps around, or it is an incoherent book with haphazardly arranged verses. While Allah Himself says in the Qur'an, إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا جَمْعَهُ وَقُرْآنَهُ فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ. Surely it is on us, our responsibility, the collecting of it, putting it together, and the reciting of it. When we recite it, follow its recitation. Its explanation is upon us. Chapter 75, verses 17 through 19. Which clearly says that Qur'an was composed, compiled, and put together by Allah Azza wa Jal Himself. Hence, no contradictions, no distortions, no meaningless words or context in it. Furthermore, ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ. The Qur'an explains itself. So, what is the nature of this coherence in the Qur'an? The following points will help in understanding it. Number one, each surah chapter has a theme around which its content revolves and makes it into a unified whole. What the soul is to a body, the theme is to a surah. Number two, together with the main text of a surah, there is an introduction and a conclusion. Surahs have distinct sections to mark thematic or contextual shifts, and every section or passage is paragraphed to mark smaller shifts. Some surahs may be without sections. The verses of the introduction and the conclusion also may at times be divided into paragraphs. Number three, these paragraphs and these sections relate to each other, but maybe not through a verse-to-verse linear connection, however, through various literary terms like similarities, comments, conditional statements, parenthetical statements, principal statements, warning statements, parallelism, conclusion of a theme, questions and their answers, and the statements or passages which return to what is said in the beginning. This is, of course, a partial list. Number 4, the context of a surah progresses through these paragraphs and sections and gradually reaches its culmination. As a result, the surah assumes a distinct and unique form and shape and becomes a complete chapter. As we have discussed in detail in the past sessions, unlike any other book that are man-made, the Qur'an learning never stops, and it can be understood in different depths. There are 3 main levels of understanding of the Qur'an. The elementary level, where the beginner takes a translation and starts reading it, and the more he reads it, the more understanding he gains, and at the same time, he gains knowledge on what the Qur'an is trying to say as a whole. In the next level, which is intermediate level, he learns the Arabic language in order to gain a deeper understanding of the meaning of the words, how they are used and why they are used in a certain context. The next level, which is the advanced level, is more for the scholars or jurists who need to have deeper understanding of the verses, especially with laws, injunctions, commands, and etiquettes, in order to drive fiqh or jurisprudence rulings. Of course, there are many levels you can reach in between these 3 levels, depending on how deep you want to understand this book. The most common mistake critics of Islam make in their interpretation is to overlook the context in which each verse was revealed. This is essential to a deeper textual understanding, especially in verses that reference wars and conflicts. One can explain Qur'an with the Qur'an. Since the Qur'an is not ordered by topic, like textbook chapters, it is necessary for one to be thoroughly familiar with other texts in the Qur'an, which deal with the same topic or relate to it. Failure to do so may alter the overall message of the Qur'an concerning that topic. In fact, other texts in the Qur'an may be highly significant in determining the true meaning of a given text. This method of understanding connections between verses, hence the passage, is another method of explaining the Qur'an and potentially more accurate than going to Asbab al-Nuzul, or a situation by which a certain verse or verses were revealed, because those rely on reports outside the Qur'an. We ask Allah to help us understand His book and help us apply it into our daily lives. We ask Allah to clean our hearts and minds from any doubts and misunderstanding of the Qur'an and guide us to the right path. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Wassalamu ala man ittaba'a al huda.